and also all of my peers for their feedback and support. It's been such an honor and so great to have been working with all of you. The title of my talk is The Statement of Who, the Narrative of the Howl Trial and its Discontents. The opening of Allen Ginsberg's Howl, his eponymous 1956 collection, Howl and Other Poems, contains some of the most canonical lines in all of 20th century American poetry. Ginsberg's salvo against the materialist, conservative, heteronormative, McCarthyist social ideology of his time begins with a statement of witness. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, he claims. With its explicit references to drug use, heterosexual and homosexual activity, and political dissent, Ginsberg's Howl became a flagship work of the Beats when it was seized by a U.S. Customs officer and San Francisco police, who also pressed an obscenity lawsuit against its publisher. But what if this event, which so many narratives have essentialized as the opposition of a single Beat generation writer and his publisher against the establishment who critiques, is more complicated than the David and Goliath story it seems to be on first glance? My answer to this question is, of course, that this narrative is more complicated. To this end, my research aims at investigating the relevance, both literary and historical, of two additional written works that also faced persecution along with Howl and Other Poems, but which have been widely neglected by historians and literary critics due to the predominance of the binary Beat versus establishment narrative. Such a narrative tends to consist of the following events. Howl itself was published in November 1956 by Lawrence Ferlinghetti as part of his Pocket Poet series at City Lights Books in San Francisco. It was seized in March 1957 by U.S. Collector of Customs Chester McPhee as 520 copies were imported from England, and again by San Francisco police in June of 1957. Ferlinghetti and his clerk were charged with selling obscene materials, but the case was dismissed by Judge Clayton Horn in October of 1957. The two written works that render this narrative problematic are the story Our Kind of Love by Safford Chamberlain, seized by McPhee a month before he seized Howl, and Gil Orlovitz's The Statement of Eric Keith and Other Stories, Poems, and a Play. Both of these works were printed in separate editions of Berkeley publisher William Margolis' magazine, Miscellaneous Man. Chamberlain's story was published in the magazine's 10th issue, which debuted in January of 1957. Orlovitz's work was purchased by plainclothes police officers along with Howl as grounds to arrest City Lights Books clerk Shigeyoshi Murao and later Lawrence Ferlinghetti for publishing obscene materials. In order to get a better sense of how Miscellaneous Man fits within the Beat aesthetic, it's helpful to take a look at a paragraph that appears in the magazine's masthead, written by its publisher and editor Bill Margolis. And I quote, "The miscellaneous man is the individual man, the human being who, as a dynamic entity, never quite fits under any label and is constantly bulging out of categories. He stands alone, but not aloof, self-sufficient and yet cooperative. He is seeking and testing creative approaches to the problems that face individual men and women that limit their humanity and chain them in a cage of mere existence," unquote. In seeking to evaluate these works and their consequences for American literary history, my research then focuses on four main areas of inquiry. Firstly, where do these works by Orlovitz and Chamberlain fit into the existent narrative of the Howl trial, and might they alter that narrative in important ways? Secondly, how do the works themselves compare aesthetically with Howl and with each other? What do their aesthetic characteristics say? Thirdly, does any archival evidence exist to support the thesis that these works may have been known, but as I argue, were eventually neglected? And regardless, do we have any good reason to attribute significance to them now? Fourthly, if it's true that these works were neglected, why was this the case? For the purposes of this talk, I will be focusing mainly on the archival evidence that substantiates my hypothesis that these works do bear significant implications for mainstream narratives of the Howl trial. I will argue that they do this by undercutting the binary opposition such narratives have constructed between the Beat generation and the institutions, usually governmental, that have fronted them. By offering related but alternative aesthetic approaches to subjects also explored in Howl, and by managing to attract enough attention to warrant their seizure, they posit a cultural history where the Beat generation writers are not alone in their confrontations with authorities, and the Howl trial, although still important, is no singular turning point for free speech. My methodology consists of three main approaches. The first and most important is my scrutiny of archival materials in the Bancroft Library at Berkeley and the Green Library Special Collection at Stanford. Of similar importance is a general overview of secondary materials regarding the Beat generation, Ginsburg, and the Howl trial in an attempt to gauge what prevailing accounts say. A third source for my research has been interviews. By talking directly with Chamberlain, now 87, and others who have had first or second-hand knowledge of relevant events, I've been able to obtain personal and empirical accounts of the histories I'm seeking to assess. Perhaps the most important question in my research, above aesthetic and temporal affinities, asks whether or not available archival materials demonstrate that these works by Orlovitz and Chamberlain were, if not conclusively important, at least present and circulating in the community in which the Howl trial took place. In what follows, I will bring forth a few of those materials. To begin, I want to cite a letter from Bill Margolis, the publisher of Miscellaneous Man, sent to Allen Ginsberg on April 4, 1964, about 7 years after the Howl trial. According to Mark A. Reed in Post-Negritude Visual and Literary Culture, Margolis and Ginsberg co-founded the literary magazine The Attitude together, along with Bob Kaufman and John Kelly in 1959, just 2 years after the trial. Margolis' letter was written in response to a letter Ginsberg sent to him pertaining to ongoing trouble with law enforcement. Because Ginsberg's letters to Margolis don't survive, the only evidence that attests to their correspondence is what remains in the Ginsberg papers at Stanford University. Luckily, in this 1964 letter, Margolis quotes Ginsberg's initial note. And I quote, "Just got the Village Voice of March 26th, and note your activities, and rush to write you, and give you my best wishes and long-distance moral support. Quote, cops arresting, film, poets they don't like, and demanding kickbacks at poetry readings, ridiculous indeed. Quote, call out the spiritual fuzz and put the cops back where they belong, on level of streetcar conductors and public servants. Who wants to pay dues to a nasty illiterate Gestapo stop, and down with police state law against the holy weed, marijuana?" So in that latter part, he's quoting Ginsberg's letter. This note demonstrates that Ginsberg and Margolis were both aware of and in communication about the conflicting interests of beat writers and the authorities. The second and last letter between Margolis and Ginsberg, contained in the Ginsberg papers, is a letter from Margolis dated December 22nd, 1968, more than 4 years after his last available correspondence. It takes on a more distant tone than that of the 1964 letter. If Margolis and Ginsberg did have a more personal relationship prior to this date, as is suggested by the fact that they co-founded The Attitude together, it seems to have faded by 1968, as Margolis expresses a wistfulness and a lofty respect for Ginsberg in the wake of an apparent accident. And I quote, "Dear Alan, for years I've wanted to write to you, just simple love and admiration, and, quote, business, unquote, matters too, like about the work, poetry. Even sent you a telegram a few months ago, care of City Lights, regarding Miscellaneous Man. But now I just want to tell you I love you and wish you speediest recovery from your accident. You are still, from my distance in years and space, one of the people I'm most thankful to have once known face to face. And during these years, whatever I have heard of you has been immeasurably helpful to me. Your love and wisdom in the world has helped make my world more beautiful." If not completely illuminating on the facts and circumstances of their friendship, Margolis' 1968 letter nonetheless shows that there was, at one point, a significant friendship between Ginsberg and the publisher of the magazine, in which the two literary pieces also involved in the Howl trial appeared. Although I have yet to find any correspondence where Ginsberg makes explicit reference to Orlovitz or Chamberlain, it is hard to know whether or not he ever did, as much of Ginsberg's remaining correspondence consists only of letters sent to him. Many of the letters he sent to friends are now lost. Despite this, the relationship between Margolis, Ginsberg, Miscellaneous Man, and the Howl trial is also solidified by the fact that 2 issues of Miscellaneous Man were in Ginsberg's possession when he transferred his estate to Stanford. A well-worn copy of the issue which contained Orlovitz's work, and the following issue, which contained a preface from Margolis about the censorship of Miscellaneous Man. And you can see that preface here. It's contained in this issue. This indicates that Ginsberg had to have been aware of the censorship of Miscellaneous Man, and possibly that he was familiar with Orlovitz's work, if not Chamberlain's. According to Margolis, Orlovitz and Chamberlain were both subject to political scrutiny, but for entirely different reasons, as he explains in that preface, titled, quote, "Censorship is their kind of hate," unquote. And this is the passage from that. Although artistically they are quite different, both Safford Chamberlain's Our Kind of Love and Allen Ginsberg's Howl have a similar concern. They are both attempts to vividly portray the tragic horror of certain aspects of our society. They are both, I believe, dead serious literary productions with morally good intentions. Both are unpleasant sermons. McPhee, and those who so readily support him, and those who are unthinkingly willing to take his word, apparently must realize their responsibility for the maintenance of those certainly tragically horrible aspects of our society and are ashamed. Margolis goes on to provide details demonstrating that the second seizure of Miscellaneous Man, which contained Orlovitz's work, was based on an error. The plainclothes officers, under the direction of Captain William Hanrahan of the Juvenile Bureau of the San Francisco Police Department, purchased the combined 11th and 12th issue along with Howl, even though the story that initially appeared in McPhee's earlier seizure, which was Chamberlain's Our Kind of Love, had been in the 10th issue, which was off the shelves by then. The combined 11th and 12th issue, however, did contain Orlovitz's The Statement of Eric McKeith, thereby involving him in the trial, however needlessly. As Margolis himself says in the preface, quote, "This gives some credibility to the current rumor that the cops can't read," unquote. There are a number of other interesting archival findings worth mentioning, including letters from Ginsberg to his father, Louis, that detail the seizure of Miscellaneous Man as well as Howl. Coverage in the San Francisco Chronicle that stipulates that Miscellaneous Man was also seized by the undercover officers who arrested Ferlinghetti and his clerk, though the coverage makes no mention of Chamberlain or Orlovitz. There are letters from anthologist Don Allen to Ferlinghetti requesting copies of Beatitude, which again Margolis and Ginsberg co-founded with others, and various notes Ginsberg had prepared for talks on censorship in the last year of his life, in the last decade also. These notes indicate that censorship and obstructionism, especially from customs and the postal service, who essentially controlled the distribution of printed materials, was far from uncommon in the 50s and 60s. In closing, my research findings clearly indicate that not only were works by Chamberlain and Orlovitz targeted by the same authorities that seized Howl, but that these works were acknowledged by Ginsberg and other individuals with central roles in the trial and Beat generation more generally. The works have historical and aesthetic affinities with Howl as well. More research, therefore, is needed to gain a finer-grained understanding of the events surrounding the Howl trial as it stands, since a narrative that dualistically contrasts Ginsberg with the law enforcement of San Francisco can no longer serve as an adequate account. Such a binary opposition might have been useful for Ginsberg, Ferlinghetti, and others who were trying to build careers on the enmity between the artistic community and what was perceived as a normative conformist bureaucracy. But it insufficiently explains the significance of the persecution of Howl and other works, including those written by writers not affiliated with the Beats like Orlovitz and Chamberlain. The relationship between the would-be censors and writers in the 1950s was almost certainly more pervasive and more insidious than is implied by recollections of the Howl trial, which treat it as an isolated incident. Thanks for listening. This concludes my presentation.